Hello and welcome to the virtual public tour of the Shear Pin Forest Management Project. This project is located on Savoy Mountain State Forest in the town of Savoy. It's approximately 75 acres in size. It has 126,000 board feet of marked saw timber, 175 cords of marked firewood, and 5 cords of marked pulp. One of the questions that we usually get early on in these tours is, what makes a tree saw timber as opposed to firewood? Well, saw timber trees meet certain specifications. In particular, at the diameter breast height, DBH, which is measured 4.5 feet off the ground, it's at least 11 inches in diameter, is generally straight, and is free from significant defects or rot. The reason being is that these trees are used for things such as finished trim in houses, cabinetry, and furniture. Those trees that don't meet those specifications are then designated as firewood. And there are certain trees that actually are so poorly formed or so rotten that they will not even meet a specification for firewood, and they are cull trees. And this actually leads me to the second question that we normally get, which is, what does all the paint mean? So, for starters, the tree right here in the foreground has a vertical blue stripe on it. That designates it as firewood. The tree, this yellow birch to my right, has vertical yellow stripes. This designates it as a tree for a skid trail. It designates it as a tree along a skid trail. Behind me, that tree has a horizontal blue stripe. That designates that tree as saw timber. And as I had mentioned earlier, cull trees are marked with an X. The X on a cull tree means that the logger has the choice of either cutting the tree or girdling it. He may take it from the woods, or if it's girdled, obviously leave it. It's because that tree, again, is so rotten or so poorly formed that it has almost little to no commercial value, and generally it's taking up valuable growing space by either being in direct proximity to a desirable residual leaf tree, or that its crown is casting so much shade that it's preventing either germination of regeneration on the ground, or preventing more desirable trees in the mid canopy from moving into the upper canopies. We also have two other designations. Depending on the size of the tree, it's either 2 orange dots or 2 orange slashes. That's for filter strips, which is an area 50 feet on either side of a wetland resource, in particular a stream. And we have either 2 red dots or 2 red slashes, and that is the sale boundary. So as you move through the sale area, now you'll understand what the paint means and what the difference in trees are. Within the Shear Pin Forest Management Project, there are 3 primary cover types. They are beech, birch, maple, hemlock with a minor component of hardwoods, and sugar maple with a minor component of other mixed hardwoods. Where I'm standing is one of those sugar maple dominated stands. In the project area, there are 2 of them. Across the landscape, they're actually rather uncommon. And the reason for this has to do with previous agricultural uses. When land is cleared and then grazed, it has significant negative impacts for those species that need rich mesic sites. So as I worked in the sugar maple dominated stands, my intention was to remove those trees that had poor health, form, or vigor, that were interfering with better growing stock and better residual trees, and to remove some of the other hardwoods that have been making their way in particular beech. And then that way the uncommon character of the stand was maintained while improving its health. The DCR puts a high priority on the protection of cultural and archaeological resources. And many times, through the course of our sale layout and timber marking activities, we run across such resources. Generally, it's in the form of stone walls and cellar holes, such as this cellar hole that's located behind me. You'll also notice that I have orange paint around here. I use that orange paint on these cellar holes because it sends the same message that it sends when it's used in filter strips. Specifically, Chapter 132 of the Forest Cutting Practices Act states that heavy equipment shall not be used inside of a filter strip. So when the harvesters show up on site, they see the orange paint in the filter strip, know that they can't take equipment inside. It's the same here. They see the orange paint, know that they can't take equipment inside. It's a function of operational simplification as opposed to not having a different color paint. This is one of the Beech birch maple stands located within the project area. The primary silvicultural objectives associated with this stand include pre-salvaging white ash and installing gaps in the canopy to ultimately encourage a new cohort of trees. Those gaps in the canopy are achieved through using group selection techniques. And what they result in is not only a variety of new trees being able to come up through, but also encourages more abundant and diverse ground cover. It's a domino effect that ultimately increases both the vertical complexity, the horizontal complexity, and the biodiversity, leading to a more resilient forest. Forest resiliency is very important, especially when you speak about things in relation to climate change, in relation to insects and disease and pathogens on the horizon. The more diverse and the more structurally complex an area is, the more opportunities there are for those forests to withstand those threats. Additionally, New England forests have a majority of their trees between 80 and 120 years old. There's very little coming up behind it, and there's very little out ahead of it. So as these forests move through time, they will begin dropping out. Trees will begin dropping out at larger and larger numbers. Canopies or gaps in the canopy will be created, and more trees will begin that age class, but there is a phenomenon called the colonization gap that waits for this all to happen at once. By getting in here and creating our new age classes now and helping to stand through that process, we also shorten and sometimes completely eliminate that colonization gap. This is the final stop on the public virtual tour. It's the Hemlock Hardwood stand. This stand was formerly a pasture. I found evidence of barbed wire fence literally growing through some of the trees along the edges, and logistically it would make sense. There's streams and wetlands that would facilitate watering livestock. And since this was all cleared at one time, what came back was preponderance of eastern hemlock. There is some red spruce and balsam fir mixed in, and then there's some scattered hardwoods. So the silvicultural objectives were to continue to perpetuate the softwood that has come up through. So I've cut the hardwoods and unhealthy eastern hemlock. There was no balsam fir and no red spruce tallied in this sale. And since those trees can reproduce under their own shade, that should provide enough space in the upper canopy for regenerating and mid-canopy softwoods to move up into those positions that are currently occupied by less desirable species. This stand also has a majority of the listed species that were found on the site, which was woodland millet and Bailey sedge. Those are primarily located along a snowmobile trail that runs through this portion of the sale area and will be used as a skid road. However, those sections with the Bailey sedge or woodland millet have been delineated with the orange marks that I use for filter strips. Again, no equipment inside the orange. As I leave this stop, one of the points that I would like to make as part of this tour is that this whole area has been heavily impacted by natural disturbances, most likely in the form of wind or ice. That tends to happen in higher elevations, and as far as forest management goes, this is one of those areas that really called for it. There's a number of trees that are literally rotting and dying from the top down, and that's not entirely unusual in areas like this, and it kind of loops around to how forestry as a whole is practiced. Forestry is meant to mimic natural disturbance. That natural disturbance does come in the form of windstorms, ice storms, microbursts, tornadoes, hurricanes, and it leaves the forest tangled, it leaves it looking messy. But what it also does is leaves tops and debris in place for small mammal habitat. It stabilizes soils and provides a shelter and more favorable microclimates for developing trees and ground cover. And so as these forestry operations take place, you will notice more debris in the woods. It'll look messy, and in the end it should look like a natural disturbance. And with that, I would like to thank you for joining me.